Ricardo, thank you so much for joining us today. As we begin, can you say a few words about where you are, your position, what you're responsible for?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Ricardo. I'm currently a field CISO at Fortinet, covering EMEA. My responsibilities are, let's say, threefold, right? First is that I help customers that are trying to understand the cybersecurity landscape, what are the major trends, also how Fortinet can help. But generally speaking, it's a bit agnostic, serving as an advisor and making sure that they have the distilled version of what I'm seeing on the market.
Mm-hmm.
Besides that, I also work internally with the product marketing and the product managers of the different solutions in order to help translate what I see with our customers and what I see on the market and making sure that we have those capabilities internally. And besides that, I also work with the community, for example, with the Cloud Native Foundation, with the Cloud Security Alliance, and the ACM as well.
Mm-hmm. I see. I understand. So this paints a picture of where you are, which is kind of like if you plot your career, that's a one point on the line. But I just want to get a sense of how this all started. How did you get into cybersecurity? What was the turning point for you?
I think if I look back in my career, I started in cybersecurity when I was very young with dial-up, even before, slightly before the 66K modems, right? Started to read what I could, like also looking at magazines like Frack, being interesting on how you could do offensive security, how to do exploits, and that's actually what's started me in that career. At the time, it was very different times. The information, there wasn't that much information. So you had to go either to IRC channels, hang around, read a lot of manual pages from the operating system. But that's how I got started, right? And also playing around with operating systems and so on. After a while, I entered the market force, right? Where I actually didn't do cybersecurity, but I was doing more networking security, right? And
Mm-hmm.
then I went into the cloud arena because at the time I was also doing private cloud. And finally, I landed back on cybersecurity almost 4 years or so ago. Obviously, all my career I've been involved in different initiatives from an infrastructure perspective, right? On how we could do security, for example, in cloud, how we could tighten those controls from an IAM perspective, making sure that we have those policies in place, but not really from a cyber vendor, pure cybersecurity perspective, if you know what I mean, Misha.
Mm-hmm. Certainly. No, it's interesting that it's you mentioned dial-up. It's taking me back a few years, and I think the landscape has changed so dramatically. Back in the day, I mean, if you remember the OG, the original gangster hackers like Kevin Mitnick and his story,
Yeah.
how he was hacking in telephone companies even before the internet era. So this concept of access and social engineering, it's really a lot older than most people realize. And it's also it's amazing how the world has changed, how the industry has changed, which makes me wonder, because sometimes I still see, I go to Black Hat RSA, I still see some of the creatives that companies use. You see this teenager in a hoodie, hunched over a computer, which is not true, I guess, anymore, because sometimes you get a sense of those APTs
Mm-hmm.
that are in conflict with each other and then doxing each other. And sometimes you see in the open access how those teams are structured. It's an enterprise level, right? So they have
It is.
HR, they have vacation policy, they have bonuses. It's
Yep.
insane, and plus like how well resourced they are. So just completely different world out there, which I think it's makes cybersecurity as a concept a lot more important for everyone on a personal level. How to make sure that in my house no one hacks my cameras, to the family, organization, government, right, across the entire
Mm-hmm.
stack. And I think a lot more people are going into cybersecurity, trying to make a career. From your experience and from your exposure to different areas of technology and cybersecurity, what would be your advice for some of the maybe younger generation of people? What should they spend time on? Is it reading manuals? Is it getting certifications? Is it getting involved in the community? Like, what would be your advice? It's time is critical resource for everyone. What should they focus on?
That's a very good question and an overloaded question. So let me unpack that. So, like you said, definitely, I believe that the old is new and the new is old. You touched on Kevin Mitnick, but even before that, Captain Crunch with those whistles freaking, right? I believe that nowadays there's still that notion of how the security is only strong as your weakest link, and that's why a lot of the CISOs nowadays still have a lot of focus on programs that target people, how to raise that awareness. And that's not in vain. It's because humans are still the weakest element in all of this, and they get targeted. All the time that you see on the news and so on, a big breach, you'll notice that there's a human element. Not always, but the majority of the time there will be, right? That brings us to today, right? Like you said, how there's clearly a gap on cybersecurity skills. Obviously, there's much more courses, but the gap is there. It's not just me saying. Also, if the analysts such as Gartner, the World Economic Forum, everyone is doing its bit, even from a country perspective. Look at what's happening in Europe, where Europe is actually creating policies in order to bring cybersecurity into the school's curricula and so on. But to answer your question concisely, I think that nowadays things are much, much structured. There's even courses, university courses. So I think the information has actually gained a new level, and it's a much more disseminated. Actually, for example, if we look at online courses, you can do online courses from top universities on cybersecurity and other topics, right? So I think we have that uh, elevation of the democratization of that information. But I think that if a youngster would ask me, hey, how can I get started? I think it's important to understand what he wants to do, because now cybersecurity is not just it's a big umbrella, right? And I think specialization is still key. You can be a jack of all trades, but I believe in this world, in order to be successful, specialization is king, right? So I think understanding what you need to do, right? Having a good foundational basis, such as networks, programming, operating system, having those foundational, I think it's key, because cybersecurity touches so many, but at least having good foundations is key. And then pursuing your specialization, if it is in forensic, if it is in compliance, if it is in web apps, Androids, so whatever it is, but I think having a good foundation is going to be key. And I think nowadays, with the amount of information, you can find clearly if it is an online course or reading the manual pages, still reading that source code. There's many avenues for that.
Certainly. So it's it sounds like it's getting this go wide but shallow to understand different aspects of it before you decide what you're going to be specializing on. It sounds like, as you it would make sense just to get exposure to different areas before you can really understand what are you good at and what are you interested in, and then dive deeper in that one area.
Definitely,
Whether it's
definitely.
pen
And I
testing, GRC, they're all they're very different, and different skill set, different things you can be excited about.
And I think that's why, if you're getting exposed to those fundamentals, such as networking, right, which is a big fundamental that sometimes gets overlooked, like operating systems, how they work internally, on how a web app works, right, getting exposed to those fundamentals, because then it will, oh, I really like to do forensics. I really like to actually code. I really like to automate this, right? I really like to do something, and then go the way that your passion is leading to.
Certainly. It's you mentioned. I just want to pull on one thread. You mentioned the weakest link, which is so true, because as as defenders, CISOs need to be right 100% of the time, but as an attacker, you only need to be right once, right? It's only if 99 people in your company received a phishing with realized they should not click on this link, but one person clicked, that's all it takes, right? So it's, and I guess the most recent example with the social engineering attack, so there's MGM and Caesars and MGM Global Entertainment, an IT provider to one of those companies. There was a social engineering attack where the IT help desk they were convinced to override multi-factor authentication, which gave access to the attackers into the system. They moved laterally. Now the entire multi-billion-dollar corporation is bricked with untold tens of millions of dollars, if not more, in damage. And it's just
that's just an example. Yes. Yeah.
It's fascinating how this fairly low cost exploit was successful at that scale. It's so, there's so much asymmetry in this, and it's just fascinating that if you just, and with tools that exist there and with sophistication, I don't even want to bring AI to this, because it's just, even without it, it's fairly low tech exploits can be extremely successful.
Exactly. Yeah.
But kind of in addition to that, you see a lot of things. I mean, EMEA, it's I mean, half of the world, if not more, right? So it's
it is, yes.
What other, if you were to name top 3 threats, attack vectors, issues that are top of mind for CISOs kind of around the world, if kind of social engineering and the human aspect of cybersecurity is one, what would be some of the one or two more that would be kind of top of mind?
Sure. So I think we touched that on the beginning of our conversation. I think if we had to put the finger, and from my conversation with customers, I believe that the human element is paramount. We see a lot of initiatives being driven on how to increase that cybersecurity awareness, right? From the organizations themselves, but also from the state members from Europe as well. I think, like we discussed, that human element. The second that we have also been seeing is that APT that we were discussing, there's a bit more targeted, and all the threat intelligence reports that are out there are indicating that there's much more activity in the APT groups. That maybe it can be because of the conflict that it's going on. But I don't believe, I'm just being careful saying this, because correlation is not causation or vice versa, right? But still, there's some geopolitical tensions going on, even with sanctions and chipsets. We all know the story, right? So I believe those APT groups are much more active than ever, and the threat intelligence reports corroborate that. And thirdly, which we discussed very briefly, maybe about the ransomware, and that ransomware as a service. I really like that book that I think it was written on the early 2000s, called Crimeware, right? Where this software, but crimeware, right? And I think all this crimeware is evolving as a service. So we have the ransomware as a service, target as a service, hackers as a service, and that changes the dynamic. It changes the dynamic because traditionally organizations were not being as targeted as much, and now there could be this group of people that are just trying to make a buck. They will be able to use those tools and start attacking organizations, and then part of the profit will be shared with who's providing those tools. And that new business model is actually increasing the ransomware, also the wiperware as well. So there's a new it's not a new trend, but it's an increasing trend that we have been seeing on those types of attacks for sure. So I would say the human element, the more activity on those APT groups, and crimeware, which I would put attacks as a service, ransomware as a service, and so on in the same bag, usage that it's increasing, and it's increasing at a double digit every year. So
certainly, it makes a lot of sense. It's again, going back to the it's not a teenager in the hoodie anymore. It's well-resourced enterprise with specialized groups who are focused on one thing only, whether it's reconnaissance or access or exploits or negotiations, what have you.
Yeah, because if you look at the cyber kill chain, right, where you have the different stages, you can bet, and this has already came to light, those groups are actually have business units, those functions specialize in one of each, like the reconnaissance, exploitation, the persistency, and so on. So it makes very hard to, like you said, the defenders need to be right, need to protect all the time, and the attacker can only be right one time, right? But just to add to that, I think it's also useful is that we're also assisting at that shift in mentality. And what I mean by that is that I believe, and I've also been seeing that risk is becoming more and more embraced. And for example, if you look at what's been happening on the regulations, which I call that first generation, were the previous regulations where you would create this strong perimeter, right?
Mhm.
And nowadays, the new regulations, they actually have this more of a assume breach mentality, right? Where you embrace risk, but it's actually what you do after that response and recovery that are key for you to bounce back, that resilience piece as well. So I see a big focus on that, on making sure that we embrace the risk, but we are able to bounce quickly from that event.
Certainly, I think it's interesting because there's different ways we can take this, but it's also I think it'll put some pressure on various organizations. And do you really need the social security number? I mean, or credit card details? And if you do ask for it, is there really a business case for it? But more importantly, do you have the infrastructure to keep it secure? Because we go to like a doctor office or a government office, they ask all sorts of information and put it in a piece of paper or they put it in the computer. And I'm more and more, I'm extremely hesitant of providing anything because I just credit report agencies, it's just, well, one, why do you need it? And two, if you do need it, how well is it protected? And I'm very not suspicious, but I'm just questioning, is there a business case? And number one, and number two, if there is, do you put resources behind protecting this information, because it's extremely sensitive, it can be used in so many different adverse ways.
Yeah. But look at this crazy idea. You would ask that organization, okay, so what's your track record on protecting that data? How do you rank in a scale, whatever, right? And then based on that, you could do an informed decision. Okay, I trust this organization to at least have some of my data, and you will hand it over. But I don't think we have that as a society. But I think there's still things that are happening that are trying to increase that. We have GDPR, right? And in California, you guys also have privacy laws. I just think that it came late, and a lot of smaller organizations really don't have the personnel or the know-how in order to, like, small organization. Will I hire a data privacy officer just to oversee my 3, 4 employees? I know it's hard still, but having some mechanisms that will allow the consumer, us, to make informed decisions on should we give this data? This is the amount that these organizations are, the amount of effort and resource they are putting in order to protect the data, my personal data. Would it make sense to me give them the data? I think it would benefit the consumers a lot, but not sure how to implement. That's a harder problem, but still, it would be a nice concept.
I think if doctors' offices and government institutions, they read enough scary headlines and they realize, well, it's a lot, we'll be much worse off if we ask for something we don't need, we have no resources or capability to protect it, and then it gets stolen and our organization is in the headlines. That's probably not a good idea. So again,
True, but those are the true, Misha. But the two verticals that you touched are, I would not say the government is highly regulated, but there's a lot of regulations and the executive orders that the US also had. from the Biden administration, right, in order to increase that cybersecurity. And in healthcare, we know how it is, but there's HIPAA and so on. It's just that securing those electronic healthcare records, it's hard. But I think there's regulation in order to do that. If the organizations are doing that, that's another conversation. But I believe that those two verticals that you touched, there's a lot of buzz and a lot of movement on what they need to do in order to secure those patients and citizens' data for sure. That's what I've been seeing.
Certainly. Makes a lot of sense. I think the winds are changing in the cybersecurity space, because for a while it felt like every other week there was another startup that's just raising, 20 million, $50 million and building a product. And you go to Black Hat or RSA, you have 400 vendors, 500 vendors. You talk to CISOs, they have 50 different vendor relationships, like 50 different dashboards to look at and to worry about, I guess, I would imagine. But I think now it seems like whether it's the economic environment or just the investing landscape is changing, and you see companies kind of running into some of the headwinds, and there is some consolidation going on. You mentioned you talked to product teams and kind of you're analyzing needs of customers versus offering, like Fortinet's offering. My sense is that these headwinds will force some sort of expedited acceleration, because I think in the end of the day, there's a use case for CISOs to deal with one or a handful of vendors and provide an integrated 360-degree solution where they don't need to worry about interoperability between two different systems. They don't need to look at 50 different dashboards, but they can look at one. Do you see this happening? Because I mean, at the end of the day, there'll be like Fortinet and Palo Alto and Checkpoint. Obviously, there'll be newcomers and disruptors, but I think it will be an order of magnitude smaller scale. That's my hunch, kind of outside looking in. But what do you see? What do you see on the inside?
So that's a very good question. Let's unpack it. I think to answer your first part, which was about the current economic landscape, I also believe that, and I was having a really good conversation with a CISO weeks or so ago regarding the M&A, the mergers and acquisition environment, right? So I think it's true. I also believe that, and with our discussions, and if we also look at the research, there's clearly an increased activity on the M&A side, and this is because a lot of the organizations, those challengers and startups were thinking after the round of series, we're thinking that maybe I'm gonna go IPO or etc. And that's not gonna happen with the valuation that happening with the economic climate, right? So now what has been happening is that a lot of those organizations are being acquired. Not just on our vertical, I think it's overall. I was talking also with the CISO of a financial institution this week, and we were just discussing that the M&A challenges that organizations have, how you integrate, and how you actually converge that cybersecurity posture all across those different functions, right? So that's a key aspect, and I think it's true what you were saying, and we are going to be seeing more and more in that. Obviously, from an M&A perspective, what's going to happen is obviously there's going to be some challenges on how you define the cybersecurity posture, especially when you're doing M&A. A large conglomerate, you're doing M&A on different organizations. It's very hard to have a centralized policy. Now, moving on into the second part of your question is more from a vendor and convergence and reducing of complexity that is also happening, but more from a push from the financial controller, or also known as the chief financial officer, the CFO, right? A lot of the organizations, I'm not seeing a decrease on the cybersecurity spend. What I'm seeing is a request from the financial controller in order to demonstrate that we are actually reducing the complexity and we are making the best out of that return of investment that we have from the cybersecurity perspective. But to your point, I also believe that what is happening on the market is that traditionally there was a lot of point product solutions. And the challenge is, how will we make sure that this 30, 40 vendors, solutions, products would talk to each other? It was a mess, right? And how it got evolved is that everyone, retail, healthcare, finance, constructions, are all placing the onus on the data, right? And what that means is that those products will produce data regarding some events, but then as organizations, they will just put it on a CM or SIM, right? But the challenge is, how do you get that data off a SIM, and how do you actually use those insights, because process data, in order to actually power and make security data-driven decisions? I think it's very hard. It's a challenge that still hasn't been solved. So the analysts came up with this concept, meaning that cybersecurity mesh architecture. Mesh has been around for a while, but making sure that everything talks to one another, the data is flowing within the different products, and that's how you actually, an organization, can prepare for the next wave of threats and so on. That's what Gartner calls the cybersecurity mesh architecture. What it means from a practical standpoint is that the vendors are going to converge. And also the organizations, where traditionally there was like 50, now it's going to be a handful of vendors. Like maybe they're going to use a specific vendor for a SASE type of solution. Maybe they're going to use a vendor for more from the response capabilities, right? Maybe they are going to use, like I said, going from this 40, 50 to a handful of vendors that actually have that integrated capabilities and are actually able to exchange data and allow the organizations to do those data-driven security decisions that will get a better return on investment.
It makes a lot of sense, because it's, why buy point solutions and worry about integration, worry about, well, if they talk to each other through an API, how secure is the API? It creates, instead of making the organization more secure, there is a plausible scenario which actually is making it less secure, because it's increasing the potential attack surface, right? So
it's complexity.
Exactly.
Either way, in my opinion, as you're increasing complexity, you're introducing risk. I think that should, in my opinion, it's simple. Maybe I'm wrong, but I believe that as long as you're introducing more complexity, you're increasing the risk. So when you're creating those, because you can, right? As long as you put duct tape, and I also came from working on the plumbing of operating systems, and I know you can do it. You put a lot of duct tape and things will work, but when they break bad, right? And that just means that that extra complexity of merging things and making sure that they work together can be actually an increased risk for the organization, for sure.
Yeah, it's too late to switch your diet to broccoli if you already had a heart attack, right? So.
Well, I'm not saying that it will not give you any benefits, but still, like so
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
maybe it's a little late to start changing the diet to broccoli, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I know we're coming up on time, Ricardo, and thank you for being so generous with your time. I guess last question. So, Afinia, kind of, we sit in between two worlds. And on the one hand, our members are cybersecurity executives, for the most part practitioners, but also deal with technology partners and cybersecurity vendors. So I'm always curious, because often vendors have this very aggressive growth targets, and CISOs often get calls from salespeople trying to schedule a demo or a meeting, and CISOs are usually overwhelmed already. They're already kind of stretched very thinly. So I always look for advice. And I think you have a very unique kind of perspective, because I mean, Fortinet, obviously one of the largest cybersecurity companies, but you also deal with cybersecurity practitioners. Just as we wrap up, what are some of the, as you talk to CISOs, what's some of the pet peeves with vendors they sometimes bring up? And from kind of the vendor perspective, what are some of the ways to really play the long game, provide value, build the relationship, and kind of reap the rewards of that? What are some of the just sound bites in
Yeah,
terms
yeah,
of
sure.
CISO pet peeves, in terms of best practices you can offer?
I think you touch on the biggest one, which is getting cold calls and getting demos from experts, right? Which sometimes is just talking about the capabilities of a product. And they really don't want that. What they really want is, obviously, they also want to interact with the vendors, but they want to understand what is the value that that vendor will provide them to their business, right? And how they can actually accelerate their business. And I think it's a very different mindset to some of those vendors. Actually, Fortinet is doing quite a good job in that regard, but still, what I'm trying to say is making sure that we are aligned with the CISO and its BU, its business unit, and making sure that we can actually translate the value of the vendor to his initiatives and accelerate his programs.
Certainly, certainly, and it does make a lot of sense. Awesome. Well, Ricardo, again, thank you so much for joining us today. Where can people find you? What's the best way to connect?
Well, I'm on LinkedIn where you can search for Secure Cyber. I'll be there. And I stopped using social media a while back. I believe LinkedIn is more than enough. So yeah, that's where you can find me. Reach out. I'm more than happy to engage in a conversation. And if you're in the London area, I'd be more than happy to buy you a pint.
Sounds good. Well, I hear they're closing a lot of pubs, so hopefully by the time we get there, there'll be still a few left open.
Oh, definitely.
Sounds good. Thanks, Ricardo.
Thank you. Have a good one. Ciao.